Yeah, look, nothing changes sentiment like price. I think it'll take less than 7 trading days this time around for outflows to peak. Perhaps I think what we're seeing right now is there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you're not really seeing a lot of action in the spot market, but you're seeing people try to position for potential reaction and an outsized move to the upside.
Welcome into another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios in New York City as we're watching Ethereum bounce back after a bit of a lackluster debut on Wall Street with all those ETFs going live. Not exactly the start that maybe a lot of people had hoped for, but maybe not worth panicking about just yet, as Bitcoin also pops a little bit today to come back as we await what headlines might come from the Bitcoin conference down in Nashville. And excited to have with us today the head of digital asset strategy over at Fundstrat, Sean Farrell, back on Coinage with us. Sean, thank you so much for coming back on, man.
Hey, Zach, thanks for having me on.
I always love chatting because whenever we have you on, we dig into the analytics, we dig into the numbers, we dig into everything like that. So we're definitely going to do that today, both for Ethereum and Bitcoin. And before we start, I just want to give a quick shout out and thank you to our sponsors over at Akash Network. Greg Osuri and co. doing great work in the decentralized cloud compute space. Our episode's brought to you by Akash Network, the world's premier decentralized compute marketplace. You can check out Akash to buy and sell computing resources securely and efficiently, purpose-built for public utility at akash.network. And Sean, let's dig into, I guess, why the Ethereum ETFs didn't go what you and I both maybe were expecting for the first 3 days of trading. We've seen volumes now dip below 1 billion on day 3. And looking at the chart, a lot of money coming out of the Ethereum, the Grayscale Ethereum Trust, maybe more than both you and I thought would. But what's your initial reaction in week one?
Yeah, certainly the outflows have been. I mean, everybody expected outflows. We did as well. I think over the first month of trading, we expected about 1.2 to 1.4 billion of outflows, and frankly, we're almost there. So I think an interesting way to put the quick exodus of capital out of ETHE into context. We've already seen about 15% of AUM leave ETHE, whereas 3 days post trading of GBTC, we were about, I think 2 to 5% of AUM having exited by now.
Yeah, so I mean, what does that maybe say about where we go from here? Because, if you want to take the bearish standpoint, you could say, well, this isn't what we expected to have happen. We didn't expect to see about, negative 180 million or so in terms of net outflows over the first 3 days. And that's not what I signed up for in terms of what these were supposed to do. Then you can take the other side, which is, I think, what you're saying, which is, look, the damage has been done. Rip the Band-Aid off, move forward. Everything's good and rosy from here. I mean, how do you think next week might go and the ensuing weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am in the latter camp there. I don't think anybody, ourselves included, expected straight up into the right post launch. I think either way, the market was going to have to digest the pace and extremity of these outflows, and it really just matters when they peak and when they start to slow. For GBTC, that was around 7 days when they peaked, post 7 trading days post launch. On day 8, they bought GBTC bottomed and expeditiously reached a new all-time high. So I think that's kind of the benchmark that investors probably have on their minds. I think over the next few days, if we start to see outflows of sub 250 million, give or take, I think we're going to see a pretty positive response. I think it'll take less than 7 trading days this time around for outflows to peak. And look, we're still pretty constructive here on ETH on a multi-week time frame.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think, obviously a lot of people on crypto Twitter were talking about the similarities to the Bitcoin ETF launches, and obviously not just comparing, I think, the grayscale outflows from GBTC and the Ethereum Trust, but just kind of some of the headlines that had also come around. This was Bitwise's Twitter account actually tweeting this. looking at kind of how the Bitcoin ETFs, or Bitcoin price rather, I should say, traded around those launches, and some of the headlines, including questioning why you even need these ETFs. And I think maybe that's just helpful to remember when it comes to, what's really unlocked here, and what it does for, I guess, traditional investors, wealth managers, to now access this digital asset. I mean, is there a message to relay to maybe people who are shaking in their boots at this point?
Yeah, I mean, we already have precedent, right? Of GBTC. Once that launched, Bitcoin sold off about 15%, and people thought it was over. And there were if people were seriously calling for a macro top at that point. A cyclical sell the news type story. Um, and to me, those extreme views are good bottom signals. Frankly, I think it's important to also to remember the context in which the ETH ETFs launched. I mean, they launched on Tuesday, and we were already seeing signs of the pretty violent crypto rally in July kind of taper off. We were starting to see factors like election odds start to really mute the Trump trade, and then into Wednesday and Thursday, we really experienced crypto finally became victim of the global degrossing that we've seen across all asset markets. And so it's tough to not factor that into the recent price action and the recent outflows, because on the margin, if there were people that were considering on holding their ETHE holdings, perhaps they were coerced by trickier macro conditions at that point, and therefore sold.
It sounds like, I mean, I guess, just to put a button on it, and kind of before we move on to Bitcoin and the rumors down in Nashville around a U.S. strategic reserve, just as far as Ethereum goes, I think last time we had chatted, we were talking about 20 to 25% kind of being the range that we would see. Obviously, through 3 days, extrapolating out, kind of a moot point, seeing as we're net negative right now. But, I mean, is there more that you'd have to see next week for you to be more confident in the idea of comparing outflows from GBTC to ETH, the Grayscale products here, to say we're out of the woods? Like, what are the things you'll be watching as we move forward? Because I think even the money coming into BlackRock's ETF is somewhat muted. But what are the key things that you're going to say, look, we should be watching these?
Muted, but inflows, frankly, are into the new eight ETFs, are not too far off from the market cap weight of ETH to Bitcoin. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's really just the front loaded outflows that we're seeing right now. I think I definitely would like to see inflows into these new eight ETFs continue, and outflows start to slow. I think Bitcoin bottomed when outflows from GBTC got to around 16 to 18% of AUM. And so I think once we reach maybe a little over that mark, we'll start to see a more more reliable indicators of a sustainable longer term bottom for ETH. So I'll be looking for those type of flows metrics. I think it'll also be important to keep an eye on that Coinbase premium. I think ETH has been trading at a pretty significant discount on Coinbase over the past couple of days. It's a pretty reliable indicator of ETF outflows, right? And so I think if we see that start to drift up, perhaps into premium territory, that'll be another good positive confirmatory data point to convince us that the lows are in.
Well, I think it's
Also,
also
I apologize if any weird noises are coming through. I have my dog here at my feet.
we got to blame the dog. If we're hearing anything weird, there's a dog by Sean. It's just an important disclosure. I don't hear anything, but I like the dog vibes. I'm wearing my Friday shirt. Just bring your pet to work day over there. I think it's all good. When we look at the charts for Bitcoin too here, Sean, I mean, it's been a real interesting month. Just kind of thinking about how people were looking at the bottom in terms of support when we were trading kind of mid 55,000, now back at 67, just kind of waiting for headlines from the conference, and people talking about potentially President Trump introducing this idea of, if he's reelected, a U.S. strategic reserve. Your latest note at Fundstrat, which, by the way, if no one's, if you're out there listening and you haven't yet realized how good Fundstrat is at strategy notes and research, check them out. But when it comes to that, Sean, I mean, you kind of were talking about how much money could make sense there. It's probably worth noting that the U.S. already has a significant chunk of Bitcoin just through the Department of Justice. You guys actually put a chart out looking at that relative to the Mt. Gox amount and what Germany just sold. I mean, talk to me about how big this idea of a U.S. strategic reserve with Bitcoin would be.
Yeah, look, I think it would be massive. It'd be a massive tailwind for price, and obviously the degree of that tailwind will ebb and flow with the GOP odds of victory in November, because obviously this is not an idea espoused by the other side of the ticket. But it certainly would be, both from a narrative perspective and from a fundamental perspective, very bullish for Bitcoin, undoubtedly. And I think the question for a lot of people is, two questions: one, why would they do this? And two, how? The why, I think, is both are actually pretty simple. The why, if you look at the current move from both sides of the aisle towards trying to onshore manufacturing over the next few years for both geopolitical and economic reasons. There's going to be a pretty large push to do what it takes to tame the dollar's strength, right? Because you have to, stimulate exports, and the only way to do that is to reduce the strength of your domestic currency. And if you do that, I think, but you still want to preserve, your nation's wealth, or preserve, the wealth housed within dollar-denominated accounts. You're going to want a hedge against monetary debasement, such that when the dollar loses its value and you have liabilities priced in other currencies, this monetary hedge can preserve that value. And it's what we've seen other economies and emerging markets do as their currencies have really struggled over the past decade or so. You've seen central banks in places such as China start to add gold to their balance sheet. Now, of course, there is a geopolitical reason for that as well. You want to diversify your asset reserves, and non-liability money is ideal in a world of global conflict. But in addition to that, Bitcoin denominated in the yuan has done quite well. So I think that's a fundamental economic reason why you'd want to house Bitcoin on your within an account with the government. How I think is a little more complicated. There are a few ways. You could have the central bank just buy Bitcoin. You could create something like an SPR, like the strategic reserve, that like the one we have for oil, or you can use this thing that is, and this is the most this is the method that is being circulated right now, is the most probable. You can use this thing called an exchange stabilization fund, which is an account of the Treasury separate and apart from their Treasury general account with the Fed, and it's used for currency stabilization purposes, helping out in times of crisis, and it mainly contains foreign currencies and some other stuff. But the idea is that, just to wrap it up, the idea is that Senator Lummis on Friday is going to supposedly put forth an initiative to bring a bill to Congress to allow the Treasury to put Bitcoin into the CSF, and purportedly Trump is going to support that initiative. And the final point, obviously, it doesn't make sense to announce this because ahead of time, because your execution price is inevitably going to be worse, right? You don't want to tell people you're going to buy a million Bitcoin before you do.
Yeah, they didn't read the playbook. It's normally you buy it, and then you shill your bag when you go on. That's what you're supposed to do, and they're doing it out of order. But yes, our friend Eleanor Terrett from Fox reported that the Senator Lummis plan to announce this this weekend. And I do think, in terms of size, that was the other thing. There's Sue Ennis from Hut 8 who's tweeting about this too. I don't know if she meant to say a million BTC versus $1 million, because $1 million would be very small, but a million BTC would be very huge. And I don't know if there's kind of an expectation in the market, because really people hadn't really been talking about this until recently. And who knows? It might not even happen. So, and to your point, it's got to be approved if they go that route through Congress. And who knows if that's going to happen too. We've seen kind of mixed results when it comes to anything crypto being discussed in Congress. So I guess maybe it's too early to say, but is there kind of anything that people should be bracing for in terms of what you think this will do to Bitcoin's price this weekend? Noted that you've also been looking at potential kind of data points around expected volatility for this weekend, just kind of given where people's heads are at.
Yeah, look, we saw a sell-off the past couple of days. We're back around 67. I think people are still uncertain, and the details will be very important in terms of what Senator Lummis and presidential candidate Trump say at the conference this weekend. I think if there was not a typo from Sue and he does announce a $1 million Bitcoin reserve, I think that is quite bearish. It certainly will not get anybody out of their seat. I think that's like 15 Bitcoin, give or take. I got to think that was a typo, but I think the importance will be in the details. But on your point on how the market is preparing, we have seen implied vols really spike for next week's expiry, and whenever you see that kind of kink in the vol curve, that tells you that people are bracing for a big move. And so perhaps I think what we're seeing right now is there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you're not really seeing a lot of action in the spot market, but you're seeing people try to position for potential reaction and an outsized move to the upside.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting kind of series of charts and a note put out by Glassnode Research, just kind of looking at, perhaps not surprising, and you and I have talked about this before in terms of liquidations, what happens when you kind of have a bunch of people betting on short-term vol and introducing some leverage around this stuff. But I think, as you've been talking about, in terms of what you've seen both in that kind of coming back in terms of open interest, and also stable coins, money pouring into stable coins, at least I think it was a couple weeks ago. Some of these kind of bullish sentiments seem to be returning right now. And, again, just to go back to the chart in terms of where we're at, I feel like things got quite dicey when we were in the mid 50s. But now that we're here kind of north of mid 60s, depending on what happens, is it fair to say that kind of gas is sitting there? And right now, that gas could be ignited by a match that maybe potentially Trump delivers this weekend, or Senator Lummis delivers this weekend, or any of that. Does that seem right in kind of how people should be looking at short-term price?
Yeah, I think so. I think, the stable coins have resumed their inflows. We saw a pretty big influx of stable coins over the past couple of weeks, particularly USDT, which, their market cap had been actually decreasing for a couple of weeks back in June. So that's obviously a good sign that capital is coming back into the fold. Volumes are returning. I think, just to circle back to the options market, you're seeing implied vols, from now through, Q4 start to creep up. And, we didn't see that in the rally back in May. And so that tells me that, people are starting to position and anticipate more upside. And often that type of bullish sentiment can get added bullish sentiment that eventually flows through to the spot market. And, when you have, market makers that have sold a lot of calls at higher levels, once you start to break these key levels, that can really add fuel to any bullish fire, so to speak.
Yeah. And I guess when we back up and kind of put all these points together, obviously there aren't a lot of guests who talk about price, but it's kind of somewhat your job in terms of nailing, as you have in the past, your price predictions for where we go. And when you put all those pieces together, I mean, obviously Tom Lee talks a lot about his price targets and 150K over a longer time horizon, but you from the very beginning of this year have kind of talked about, I think, north of 116K to be very specific, and kind of in that 125K range for where Bitcoin could go. just given everything that we've seen, I know every time you're on, I ask you, is that still your price target? But it does seem like I've grown increasingly more confident in those as we moved along the year. I mean, how about yourself?
Yeah, look, nothing changes sentiment like price. So I think as price creeps up, it certainly becomes more plausible. I think we've stuck to that price target and think it's still quite plausible, and we're fairly confident in it at this point. I think if you look at things from a macro perspective as well, you have, you had another pretty cool, in our opinion, PC number today. We're starting to see pretty, the soft housing auto price data is really coming through in rate expectation markets. A lot of people I think are concerned about the job market, particularly in the manufacturing side of things, starting to potentially trigger a lot of recession indicators over the next couple of quarters. And
Hmm.
with that in mind, and with the Fed's dual mandate in mind, I think there's we think next week will bring about a pretty dovish FOMC meeting, which could bring some added weakness to the dollar and rates, and continue to fuel the ongoing cyclical bull market.
I think that's not to be overlooked too, because so many people talk about on-chain metrics, so many people talk about kind of deep in the weeds crypto moves, but you think about how small the crypto market actually is relative to the other traditional markets and what really moves those in terms of the Fed. We didn't even talk about those until almost basically at the end of our time here. And as you've documented, those are important metrics to keep your eyes on. And given all of that, so much talk is about Bitcoin and Ethereum, but I don't want to overlook Solana either, because that's another one where all my friends have been hitting me up right now about, hey, what's the next ETF to come? We had Hester Peirce on the show talking about those and what hurdles might need to be there. James Seyfert from Bloomberg also kind of talking about, given everything, probably not until 2025 to have those approved. I mean, when you look at Solana and headwinds there, or tailwinds, I should say, just kind of given where usage is at, what you've seen built in that ecosystem, I mean, if you had to say, maybe this is a better question, which one of your price calls from the beginning of the year you're most confident in? I think you had Solana north of 500 bucks. We already talked Bitcoin and Ethereum. I mean, is that one maybe even more confident given how much room is still room left to run?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of overhead space between, I think, 180 where we're at right now with Sol and 550. Um, so I don't know. I don't know if I'm as confident to the decimal point in that price target as Bitcoin, but I am very confident in significant added upside and beta to Bitcoin through year end on Solana. I would not be surprised if we break that $500 target. I think the big thing with Solana, we've continued to see DEX volume soar, adoption, from the on-chain level, like you mentioned, continue to be very strong, especially as compared to ETH and its L2s. And, from a traditional financial markets perspective, you're seeing a lot more interest, and I think you're going to really start to see the race to get Sol futures on the CME really start to heat up over the
Hmm.
next several months, which I think will be very beneficial to price as people start to speculate on Solana being the next up in the ETF conversation. So that's I think another structural tailwind for Solana going forward over the next
Well,
several quarters.
yeah, one thing that I think is always interesting too, I got two more questions for you. One being kind of Ethereum and why you think maybe some of this has been soft when we look at kind of the way that the ETFs were launched. I wonder, even for people in crypto, myself, I'm talking about, some of the narrative has kind of gotten a little wishy-washy, just kind of given all the L2s and kind of demand for block space, and the idea that ETH, I think, has turned somewhat inflationary recently. Um, I don't know if it's because it's more complicated to sell to non-crypto people, but that does seem, when you could say, look, there's only 21 million ever to be printed on Bitcoin, and then Ethereum, it's like, well, actually, we're weirdly shifting a little bit inflationary relative to where we were before. I wonder if that's an element, just kind of comparing ETH and Solana, that maybe at the wrong time things turned for Ethereum.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the Ethereum is dead conversations are, a bit unfounded. I think when you look at its, that community's strategy and the roadmap and what they're executing on, I think it is still well on its way to its goal of modular expansion. And I think there are very easy ways to sell to TradFi. I think people that are in the weeds and see the differences between ETH and Solana and all these other assets, I think they appreciate why the sale, because there's so much debate between ETH and Sol between us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we understand those nuances. But really, if you just sell it as this tech stock to TradFi, it's a pretty simple explanation, right? It's this DeFi social consumer app store that is distributed and not controlled by any single entity. So it's I think people will be able to sell it as this beta to Bitcoin. I do think at some point it will continue to resume its historical high beta relationship to Bitcoin, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that portfolios necessarily have to be mutually exclusive to Bitcoin or ETH. I think that's been a big question in terms of will ETH siphon flows from Bitcoin. I don't know if that's entirely true either. But yeah, I think ETH will still be a buy here pretty soon, and we're also pretty confident in that our around $7,000 price target for year end in ETH.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, I think it's a little too early to tell in terms of some of that cannibalization talk, and I'm also in the same camp that I feel like they are complementary, just kind of given what we've seen for people in crypto, but a little bit early on the ETF side in terms of flows. Last question for you though, Sean, just kind of looking ahead beyond what we had talked about in the strategic reserve vein of questions. As we talked about, the U.S. already has about 13 billion in Bitcoin through mostly the DOJ. Is there a number that you would say you would be impressed by if it is announced? And again, still kind of probably has to go through Congress, but what's kind of the number you think would actually move markets if we do hear one uh, this weekend?
Yeah, look, I think I just yeah, I think I was eventually we were getting to this earlier in the conversation, but remember we were talking about the execution and uh, why would you signal to the market that you're going to buy a bunch of Bitcoin? I think that the easy solution here, as I think you're alluding to, is that they could just siphon the Bitcoin from the DOJ asset seizures, right? And that is, as you mentioned, I think it was 13 billion or 13.8 billion, something like that. And there you go. It's probably over 14 billion today. And that would make up, I think, almost 7% of the current asset value within that exchange stabilization fund that I mentioned. And I think that would be a very exciting proposition for the market because it wouldn't be net new buys, but it would take 14 billion of future selling pressure off the market, and would likely indicate that the ESF would be engaging in some kind of strategy to acquire more Bitcoin in the future. And so that would certainly excite people. I think anything over, over a billion would probably be worth mentioning. But
Yeah, especially
yeah,
kind of given the fact that we saw Germany kind of dump 3 billion or so not too
right.
long ago. Somewhat in the same wheelhouse. But as always, Sean, love having you on. And again, to anybody who's listening or watching and hasn't yet subscribed or joined FS Insight over there at Fundstrat, one more shout out to all the great work that Sean does and the Fundstrat team does. If you're, of course, a Coinage member, we've already talked about this, but there's a way to access their research through our membership as well at coinage.media. You can hit us up in the Discord for more. Sean, thanks so much for coming on, man. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, Zach, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll be chatting and we'll be watching this weekend. All the big headlines to come from the Bitcoin conference down in Nashville will be on coinage.media. The biggest headlines sourced from our community. Sean Farrell, thank you so much. For Sean, for everybody here at Coinage, thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Coinage. You can check out all of our interviews on YouTube as well. Click the bell, subscribe, and you can also, as always, join our community of co-owners at coinage.media. I'm Zach Guzman. We'll see you again soon.